Hello and welcome to the third part of lecture 4 of Programming Fundamentals module. In this part, we will continue our discussion on repetitive control structures, more information about loops. In the previous section, we looked at for loops in detail, which we identify as a definite looping structure because beforehand we know how many times it should be repeated. However, while loop is different from that. So the while loop repeats the block of statements as long as a condition is true. So the programmer has lots of control, more control than the for loop. In a way, we can identify that as while loop while loop being more powerful than the for loop. So we will formally introduce the format of the while loop. So the keyword, the most important keyword is while, and then there's an expression. So this is the condition. So expression will provide the condition. Until that condition is met, the while loop will continue. It will continue repeating the block of statements. So here, indented, you will write the statements. Anything inside the while loop will be repeated. So in order to be included in the while loop, you have to indent all the lines inside. So similar to previous occasion, or similar to a for loop, the block of statements executed repeatedly, it's identified as the loop body. So here these statements are identified as the loop body, which should be indented similar to that of a for loop. However, as I said, the programmer has much more control, initializing, incrementing, and other actions on the elements of the condition should be taken care of by the programmer because those conditions are directly affecting the operation of the while loop. So if you do not properly set those, you will have some unwanted behaviors using the while loop. For example, a while loop can be running forever, infinitely running. So that kind of situation may not be expected most of the times. So here we are looking at an example of while loop, a sample implementation of a while loop, a very simple one. So the first line of our program is taking input as a number, enter the number of times to repeat. So it's converted to an integer and assigned to a variable named num. And then in the next line, we introduce the while loop. The while keyword is there and the condition. So what is this expression? Num is not equal to 0. So we have the variable num here introduced at the very beginning, and this while loop will run until this condition is satisfied. That is, as long as the num is not equal to 0. So then we have the body of the loop, body of the while loop. So what happens? We need to print hello world, right? Very basic. And then in the next line, we decrement the value of num. So what do we mean by decrement? Decrement by 1, we reduce the value by 1 at each iteration of the while loop. So what happens if we enter a number? Let's say we enter number 2. So it will start from number 2, and at the starting point the number is not equal to 0. Obviously it will go into the body of the loop and it will print hello world. And what happens in the next line? The number will be decremented by 1. The num will be decremented by 1 and it will become 1, and then it will go back to a new iteration of the while loop, and this time it will also print hello world, and when it's here, it will be once again decremented. So it will be, now it is 1, and when it is decremented by 1, it becomes 0. So now the condition will become false and the while loop will be ended. Okay, so we also have outside the while loop, we have a print statement end to denote that the while loop has ended. So you notice the indentation in these two lines denoting that these two lines of code should be the body of the while loop, and this one is outside the while loop. So looking at the expected behavior and the output of this short program, so it will first ask the user to enter the number of times to repeat. So let's say, for example, user inputs 5 and it will print hello world, first iteration, hello world again, second iteration, third iteration, fourth, fifth, because the user entered number 5, and at the fifth iteration the variable num will be 0, and then it will jump out of the while loop and it will print end because it came out of the while loop. So now we have this example on Python tutor. So let's see how the program goes through in individual steps. So we already are familiar, we already have discussed and explained about how this program operates, but let's confirm that using Python tutor. So it's already in the first line expecting users input, so we'll input the same number, which is number 5, and hit submit, and now you can see the first line is executed. It is taken the number, and the num is assigned the value 5, and then it will now go into the while loop. Okay, so obviously num is not equal to 0 at this stage. It will go into the while loop and it will print hello world. You can see in the print output, and when we hit next, see what happened to the num variable. It became 4. Why did it become 4? It was decremented by 1. Still num is not equal to 0. It will still go into the while loop and print hello world again, and then the next step num becomes 3. So this will happen for another 2 steps. Hello world for the 4th time, num is 2 and it becomes 1 as it is decremented. Once again it will go into the while loop. Hello world is printed for the 5th time, and now special thing happens, num becomes 0, and now this condition will be false. It will be 0, so while loop will not continue, and when we hit next, the execution will come outside of the while loop and it will come into this print statement, and when we hit next, it will print end. So that is the behavior of this while loop example. So behind the discussion of repetitive structures, looping structures, so we have now the general understanding that when to use for loop and when to use a while loop. So the for loop is a definitive loop. We generally use a for loop when the number of iterations can be identified or known at the program compilation or before the execution of the loop. So if it is known beforehand the number of repetitions we need or we would get, we can use a for loop without hesitation. But all the other situations we might need to use a while loop, right? So for is a definitive situation, while can be an indefinite situation. So bringing the argument that while loop can be more powerful than the for loop, also stating that the programmer has more control when using the while loop, because the programmer has to define the condition, define when the condition starts, condition is made true, and decide when the condition is made false, and so that take more control of the looping mechanism. So that's why a while loop provides more control to the programmer, as well as then it can sometimes be dangerous as well. So if you do not implement that correctly, your program can give unwanted results, unexpected results. So that's why you should be a bit careful when using while loops. Also in for loops, you have to implement them correctly, but it is actually uh, because it's definite, because it is known how many times, it's a little bit clearer than using a while loop. You have used else clauses with if conditions in one of the previous lessons. Uh, with loops also, you can use else clauses with both while loops as well as for loops. Python does allow that. So if it is used with a for loop, um, else clause is executed after the loop has exhausted, iterating through the list. So basically, the for loop has to uh, finish, and then execution has to come out of the for loop. And when that happens, else clause will be executed. So when it is applied to a while loop, the else clause is executed when the loop condition becomes false. So it is operating based on a condition. While loop, we have seen that, and when that condition becomes false, the execution has to come out of the while loop, and in that position, it will execute the else clause. And this is assuming the loop is not abruptly exceeding with a break. So I am introducing this here, but we will have more information about the break later on. So this is also an important part when it comes to loops in Python. So we will discuss that very soon. So now we look at an example of a while loop having an else clause as well. So we initialize by defining a variable named count and initializing that to be 0. And then we introduce the while loop. So the condition is count should be less than 5, and inside the while loop we have a print statement. So we print the count, the value of count, and following the string is less than 5. So we also do another thing inside the while loop, within the body of the while loop, because you see the indentations, count is incremented. So we start the count with 0, and as the while loop progresses, the count is incremented by 1, and the condition checking is count is less than 5. And then also the else clause is given, and within the else clause, you see the indentation once again. Whatever that's indented after the else keyword will be executed within the else clause. So there's also a print statement inside the else clause, and which basically prints that. So we know that from the previous slide that when this else clause will be executed, that will be executed when this condition becomes false. So we can say within the else clause we will print count and is not less than 5, and finally we will, after all that, we will print end as well. So this is not included in either the while loop or the else clause because you don't see the indentation. So looking at the output that we expect from this program, so we start from 0. 0 is less than 5. Then it is the count is incremented. The second step, it is 1. it is still less than 5. Third step, 2 is less than 5. Third step, fourth step, 3 is less than 5. Fifth step, 4 is less than 5. And when it reaches 5, then this condition becomes false, and then it comes out of the while loop. And here there's a special thing to do because there's a else clause as well. So we have to print that, we have to execute whatever that is inside the else clause as well. So when the count becomes 5, this print statement is executed and it is printing 5 is not less than 5, which is true. So eventually it should also print the end. Once the while loop and the else clause is done, it will come into the last line of the program. We will go through the example in Python tutor as well. So we have loaded that into the Python tutor. So the same program. So we will start. So we know that it starts from initializing the count to be 0 and then moves on to the while loop, and it goes inside the while loop because 0 is less than 5 and prints 0 is less than 5. So the while loop will go on until count becomes 5. So it is still less than 5, still less than 5. Now at this point the count will be incremented to 5. So the condition is no longer satisfied, so it will jump out of the while loop, but it has to go into the else clause because we have defined an else clause in this example alongside the while loop. So it will go into the else clause and execute the print statement inside the else clause and say 5 is not less than 5. And eventually, after all that finished, the last print statement will be executed, printing end. So that is the behavior of this Python program, having a while loop alongside an else clause. And here are some fun facts. How did the programmer die in the shower? Can anybody guess? Because the shampoo instructions say apply, rinse and repeat. So this is a repetitive action, a repetitive control structure. But there's a problem with that because it is not stated when to stop repeating. So what will the programmer do? He or she will likely apply, rinse and repeat indefinitely, infinitely. So if that happens over and over without stopping, the programmer is likely to have some issues, some poisoning, something like that, and is likely to be affected. His or her life may be affected. So it's once again showcasing the importance of repeat, but also taking control. So if you don't specify correctly when to stop repeating, when to end the looping structure, especially with regards to while loop, so that would be problematic. So that example is saying or showcasing the importance of taking control and correctly implementing loops. And once again, how many programmers does it take to change a light bulb? Any guesses on that? The obvious answer from a programmer would be none, because it's a hardware problem. So we don't touch hardware related issues. So we are programmers. So that would be the typical answer from a programmer. Thirdly, there are 1-0 kinds of people, those that understand binary and who do not. Did you get that? Do we have 10 kinds of people, or do we have 1-0 kinds of people? So in the second statement says those that understand binary and who do not. I hope you get that. Another important concept when it comes to looping. So this is nesting of loops. In other words, loop within a loop, loop inside a loop. So this is called a nested loop. So in this example, this is a nested for while loop, combination of a for loop and a while loop. So the outer loop is a for loop and the inner loop is a while loop. So once again, you have to carefully define the while loop and control it, because otherwise this can be running forever and it will not stop, and it will give unexpected results from your computer program. So next example is a syntax for a nested while for loop. So the order is reversed. So the outer loop is a while loop and the inner loop is a for loop. So you have statements within the while loop. You have the for loop, and the for loop's body is here indented, and the while loop's body is containing the whole for loop as well as more statements. So in this case, however, notice that there's no other statements for included in the body of the for loop other than the while loop itself. So if we had something here in this indentation, that will be included as part of the body of the outer for loop. So nesting of loops, so these are only two ways of doing it, but you can have many other combinations. You can even have more than 2, 3 for loops nested, for example. 4 inside a 4 inside a 4. You can have that kind of nesting. Let's look at an example where we can employ nested loops. So the requirement is to write a program to display the following pattern using a nested loop. So we have dollar signs. How many dollar signs in a row? 10 dollar signs, and we need to have 5 rows like that. So we will look at how to implement this program using nested loops. Actually, if you just need this, you don't even need nested loops to do this kind of thing. Specifically for this kind of implementation, only having 5 rows, you can just print it. But what is expected from us is to use nested loops. So you can extend your knowledge to write more complicated programs using nested loops. Once you try this, and once you get an understanding of how to implement or how to utilize nested loops in this kind of a implementation. How we implement that program using 2 for loops or nested for loops. So what does the first or the outer for loop does? It operates on a range from 0 to 5. So these are for the rows, right? We remember that we needed 5 rows. So you get a range 0 to 5. That means you get how many elements? 5 numbers or 5 elements in that range, starting from 0 going until 4. 5 is not included. So what happens in the inner for loop? It defines a range from 0 to 10 because we need 10 items per each row. 0 to 10, that means including 0, it will go up to 9, which has 10 elements. 10 is not included, but in the sequence you will have 10 elements. And inside the inner for loop, the body of the inner for loop will contain a print statement which prints a dollar, and you'll see that specifically there's the end argument, or the end parameter is also defined, because by default if you just use print, it will append a new line character if you do not specify the end argument for the print statement. So we need to print the dollar signs one after the other, not one below the other, but one after the other in the same row. That's why we need to specify this end parameter as well. And as the body of the outer for loop, we have a print statement, once again specifying or printing or adding a new line character, because we need to have 5 rows. Okay, so then end is also defined after adding the new line character. So we will see how this program operates using the Python tutor. Here is how the program operates. So we have a nested for loop, outer for loop and an inner for loop. So let's go forward, hit next to go inside the outer for loop, and the x value is 0. So next go inside the inner for loop, y value is, the starting y value is 0, and it will now execute the print statement which prints a dollar, and it will stay inside the inner for loop until this sequence is exhausted. So y becomes 1, x is 0, but y becomes 1 and a dollar sign is printed. So this happens until how many dollar signs are printed? 10 dollar signs are printed. So now the y value is 9. So 10 dollar signs are now printed. Now this will exit the inner for loop and print a new line so that we can have the next 10 dollar signs in a new line. Okay, now goes into the next iteration of the outer for loop, and notice the difference in the x value. In the next step it becomes 1, and then the same thing happens in the second line. 10 dollar signs will be printed. So this is now going through the inner for loop until 10 dollar signs are printed until y becomes 9, and when y becomes 9, the inner for loop exits and the print statement that belongs to the outer for loop executed. And now once again x is now incremented to 2. So x is now given the value 2. Similarly, this program will execute to print 10 dollar signs in the third row, and this will happen until 5 rows are completed. There's one more row. And when we hit next, it will now finish, because we just wanted 5 rows of dollar signs, and then it will exit the program. It is done running now. So that's how this nested for loop implementation enables us to print this kind of a pattern, including 10 dollar signs in a row and 5 rows like that. So you should be able to look at this example and extend this example to print different patterns. Here's an opportunity for you to extend based on the previous example to write a program to display the following symbol pattern. So this time with asterisks using a nested loop. So this is different from the previous one, because previously each row contained similar number of symbols, but this time you have to change that, so that in the first row it will be only 1 symbol, second row 2 symbols, third row 3 symbols, and like that. So please have a look at this, please attempt this, try to do changes to the previous example to achieve or to get this kind of an output from this nested loop implementation. That brings us to the end of part 3 of lecture 4.